go ahead and get started. We first of all want to thank you all for coming out. SBA is happy to put on this event for you guys, but we not only want to thank you for coming out to this event. As you guys have noticed, we've had a week-long course of events, and we appreciate you guys for participating in the citizenship test on Monday and allowing us to serve you guys food on Tuesday. Those of you who participated in paint night on Wednesday, and even those of you guys who are coming to the Marshall event tonight. We have had an extreme amount of participation from students and faculty, and we just really appreciate it. The program is, Dr. Hodo is going to give everyone an introduction. Omar Jamal, one of our students, is going to introduce his clinical client, which is going to be our guest speaker. We're going to have a presentation by Professor Roederer, a presentation by Professor Kolenc, and then they're just going to engage you guys in a general discussion about DACA and about the travel ban. And then we'll have questions, so what we'll do is the wireless microphone, we'll pass it around and allow you all to ask questions, and Dr. Hodo will moderate those questions. And then we'll do a brief closing. So once again, thank you all for coming out, and we appreciate your support, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Good afternoon. I just want to echo what Jenny said. I think it's a great turnout. I think this is a very important topic. First, I want to read a quote. Our nation is built upon a history of immigration, dating back to our first pioneers, the Pilgrims. For more than 3 centuries, we have welcomed generations of immigrants to our melting pot of hyphenated American. British Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Jewish Americans, Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, and Indian Americans. So the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, the program was formed through executive order by former President Barack Obama in 2002 and allowed certain people called Dreamers who came to the U.S. illegally as minors to be protected from immediate deportation. Those who had been in the U.S. since 2007 and came before they were 16 years old, and those who were under the age of 31 before June 15, 2012, when the bill went into effect, qualified. Applicants for DACA must be in school, have a high school diploma, or be a military veteran. They must also have a mostly clean criminal record, and recipients are able to request consideration of deferred action for a period of 2 years, which is subject to renewal. The status doesn't put participants on a path to permanent legal residency or citizenship. What it does mean is that they can obtain a driver's license, credit cards, and open bank accounts. Deferred action is a use of discretion to defer removal action against an individual for a certain period of time. Deferred action does not provide lawful status at this point. Right now, we have nearly 800,000 Dreamers in America under this program's umbrella. And if they are forced to leave, it could cost our economy $500 billion. So that's the introduction of what the program is. And now I would like to ask Omar if he would come up and present our guest speaker.
Good afternoon. My name is Omar Jamal, and I'm a senior clinical student representative at Florida Coast School of Law's Immigrant and Human Rights Commission. With no fault of their own, many children who enter the United States experience the constant lingering ills of deportation. Many of these children grow up in fear, learning to tread lightly, to not make a sound, and to go on living life afraid and virtually unheard. Today, we will hear from one of these individuals, an amazing human being, with an incredible story, Mr. Joshua Moncrief, a client of mine whose DACA application was recently approved. Congratulations. Please help me welcome to today's podium, Mr. Joshua Moncrief.
Hi, how are you guys? Also nervous. This is our first time speaking publicly. I'm a little nervous. Anyway, I'm Joshua Moncrief. I am 30 years old, born in 1987. I like long walks on the beach. But just kidding. But to kind of start my story, I have a great aunt that was a missionary to Mexico, in Mecca, actually. And this little girl, she was the age of 12. She was seeking my aunt for help because she was pregnant at the time with me. I don't know what happened. I really don't know the whole story, but my mom, I guess you can say that. I know as my mom. Today, she couldn't have any children, and my aunt called my mom and told her, hey, I have this little girl, this little 12-year-old girl who's pregnant, and I know you've been praying for a child for so long, and I was wondering if you were interested in adopting this child. And of course my mom said, of course I do, and she came over to Mexico, and she came and got me as soon as I was born, of course. Immediately I was born, my birth mom, I guess, skipped out and kind of abandoned a little bit. So, anyway, mom brought me over to the U.S. Oh my gosh, I'm really nervous. She brought me over to the U.S. and for the longest time, I felt like one of y'all. This is really normal. You do whatever, drive, whatnot. Went through high school, and when I was 15 years old, so I drive to A class, and I got my waiver to get my learner's license. Well, one day at school, I asked my mom, I said, hey, when can we go get my learners? And she was telling me, not today, I'm busy, I gotta work, I got a long day. And this had been, I've been asking her to take me for several weeks, and so one day she finally told me that, hey, your adoption, there were some complications, and she basically told me that I was illegal, I couldn't drive and stuff. So she told me that. I wasn't angry, I was just sad, and I really didn't realize how that would affect me later on in life. And then I found out, I can't get a driver's license, I can't open a bank account, I can't do the normal things that any of y'all could do. So that's a little embarrassing for a 15-year-old, and then when you're an adult, you gotta depend on people for rides everywhere, and there's people that you can't trust, and you can't tell them your whole story because you're afraid of what they might think of you differently. You just really don't know what they think. We went through several attorneys, quite a bit of attorneys actually, to help fix my situation, and they never could. All they, this is money, and but until my mom met Ann Duggar, she's the founder of the Justice Coalition. She knew Miss Corinne, and she got in touch with Miss Corinne, and Miss Corinne got in touch with me, and we went from here, and I worked with a lot of private citizens here, and Mr. Omar, and we did the DACA application, and what was it, this is the second year now, I think? Yeah, it was the second year, and this past 2 weeks ago, I think, I finally got the approval for DACA, and then I got my EAD card, my work employment card, and this past week I got my learner's license, opened a bank account, and which is really excited. I probably texted Omar 1,000 times, and Miss Karen too. Emailed her quite a bit of times, like, oh my God, I'm so excited. But yeah, it's really been a struggle, just for all my life. Just not feeling normal, not feeling free. Whenever 4th of July came around, it was kind of like a bummer for me, because like, what do I have to celebrate? I can't drive, I can't do anything. It left me in a bitter state, you could say, if I could say, like, it left me really bitter and angry. But honestly, like, some of you might believe in God or not, I don't know. But I do. God has handled me this whole entire time, throughout my bitterness, throughout my anger. He stayed faithful when I was not, at times. But he has used Mr. Omar, Ms. Currier, Ms. Kolenc, all down just in my life recently. And I have a big thank you for them for getting me through all of this. And it's awesome. It's amazing. But I lost my train of thought. But it has been really difficult until recently, and now I'm starting to drive and learning how Jacksonville drivers are. But yeah. I think that's all I have to say. This year has really turned out to be a really great year for me, and I hope that other DACA applicants can get approved so they can actually feel free. So, and they won't have to struggle anymore. I think that's all I have to say.
I just think it's important that we recognize Joshua, because I think a lot of times it's really easy to have these conversations and debates when you don't actually see the people that it's impacting. So again, Joshua, just thank you for your testimony. I think that's so important, because a lot of times we debate these ideals of grandeur and we don't have the face that goes with it. And it's just very important to do that.
And with Dr. Hodo's recognition, we wanted to present something to Joshua for coming out to speak with us and share his story with us.
So now we'll go ahead and begin the presentations. First, we have Professor Roederer. And you're waiting on the last part, weren't you? I know, usually I say Professor Roederer, but since we're in a professional environment today, I'm Professor Roederer. And then we also have Professor Kolenc. Each will be presenting and discussing DACA. So, Professor Roederer, sir.
Look more authoritative this way. Sorry, I usually don't dress quite like this, but I thought I would be a little more professional for the day, since you were going to use my proper name. So, a few things to point out. Joshua, if you would have been a couple years older, you would have been eligible for DACA, correct? So, DACA also has an aging out provision that if people have been in this country for, just a few more years, about 30, you would have been 32, 33, you would have aged out of that and not been eligible for DACA, even though all the same things would have applied, right? You wouldn't have had the ability to have a driver's license, you shouldn't have been working. If you're working, you shouldn't have a social security number, none of those things that allow you to be, a normal American person, right? And so, Now, DACA, when it first came out, right, by President Obama, a lot of people go, well, it didn't go through the proper processes, right? It didn't go through notice and comment. This was the executive taking over legislative functions, and all of that was, for some people, that was legislative or executive overreach into something that the executive shouldn't have been doing, but Congress should have been doing, right? And you have President Trump sort of saying that, right, that Congress should do this, giving it back to Congress to do this and figure it out and do it right. But if they don't, I'm going to revisit it and maybe just do exactly what Obama did, except maybe do it my way, whatever that means. And so it would have been ideal if Congress could have gotten together and done the right thing by this group of people that are, for all intents and purposes, is American and more American than a lot of us, right? But they haven't. Now, deferred action, though, is something that's been around for ages, right? Agencies have to prioritize how they faithfully execute the laws. And in terms of deciding who should be deported or not deported, children of immigrants are basically at the bottom of that list of people to deport, right? Particularly children of immigrants. They didn't come here by their own choosing necessarily, right? They were bought over by their parents. They haven't committed crimes, right? So if you haven't committed felonies, now you can have a few little misdemeanors, but no serious misdemeanors, whatever that means, right? If you haven't committed crimes, you've been here, you haven't been going and coming, so it's not like you can go back to the country you're coming from. Those people would have been deferred de facto anyway, and they have been deferred de facto. They haven't been deported throughout most of the history of choosing who to deport. So really what the Obama administration did was just put into something a little more systematic so that people could organize their lives around it, the kind of things that were already happening anyway with children who were brought over by their parents. But it also did a few other things, right? It allows you now to live and walk and breathe and be like an American, right? And not have to live at the margins where you have to sneak work, where you can't, get a driver's license. You can, the Supreme Court said you can get an education though, right? At least the Supreme Court finally said you cannot punish the children of immigrants just because their parents brought them over and not let them get an education. But so you get an education, but you can't get a job, right? And you can't drive. And so really the DACA program was meant to sort of bring people into the mainstream and not have them live at the margins where, honestly, your only real options are crime unless you have other people to support you. You have to fake Social Security numbers, which also, is a crime. And you got to do all sorts of other things if you want to just be able to live in the only country you know, right? So Trump then comes along and is going to just get rid of it, right? And it's, well, Obama got to just create it, so Trump should be able to just get rid of it. But there's radical differences between the two, right? Obama in some ways was regularizing something that was already happening in terms of deferred action. And deferred action already was established and would give people certain rights like the right to work, obtain work permits, and so on. But the Trump approach, which is just throw it all out, right? A sweeping new regulation that undermines 5 years of practice, 5 years where people have come to rely on a set of rights, privileges, right? Maybe not call them rights, privileges. But he did it all without any notice or comment or any ability for not only the DACA recipients themselves, but as we said, businesses, right? Businesses are going to be harmed significantly by this. Universities, schools are all going to be harmed significantly by this, right? And there was no notice and comment or ability for them to put any input into the impacts of this on their businesses, their universities, not to mention just the human beings who will be severely impacted by this. So, the simple answer and why there's challenges to this and why it's probably going to be struck down, in my opinion, is the rescission is going to be considered to be illegal or unlawful. is that it didn't go through any notice and comments, right? And they really don't have any good reasons for rescinding it, right? Even if they did, they need to have some decent reason for Trump to be able to simply rescind this policy or change the rule, and they really don't have it. The closest argument that they've made is that they struck down DACA, which was Deferred Action for Parents of Children, right? But parents of children are very different. The parents chose to come over here, right? Parents don't have the same rights as the children did. We've already, the Supreme Court's already said that the children have those rights. DACA may even have been struck down because it didn't follow the Administrative Procedure Act and give notice and comment, right? And so the point of all that is that, when people have come to rely on a set of things that the government has given them for 5 years, it's not that the government can't undo that. The government can undo it. Congress can undo it, and even administrative agencies can do it. But they have to do it following a process, a set of procedures. They have to get input from stakeholders, from the community. And they have to actually have good reasons for why they change a set of rules or policies. And the administration at this point has not provided any, at least not in my opinion. And so that's why I think DACA will continue, right, at least hopefully into the foreseeable future, and that the rescission of DACA will be found to be illegal. Now, Professor Kolenc has different views on that. Sadly, he's wrong. But anyway, I'll cede to him, and then we'll come back for the next set.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for all being out here on this really important topic. Joshua, thank you for coming out. I know how difficult that must be, and to have to hear people up here talking about a program that you rely on so much is, I'm sure, very difficult. And thankfully, I'm the guy that gets to come up here and have to give the alternate point of view. So I don't think it's lost on me that I have to look Joshua in the eye as I'm saying some of these things. Thanks again, Tim. But in all seriousness, actually, I'm conflicted on this issue. I'm a Catholic by faith, a practicing Catholic. The Catholic Church has always been very strong in support of these types of programs. I went and looked at what the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops had to say about President Trump rescinding DACA, and although the conference itself didn't make an official statement, several of the high-ranking members of the conference said some very strong things about it. They called the cancellation of the program reprehensible, causing unnecessary fear. They talked about how the church has recognized the need to welcome young people, and that the church supports you and will advocate you. So, as a Catholic, it's always difficult for me to think about this issue because I know there's real people, real good people who came here, and in many cases with DACA, of course, they were minors, they came through no fault of their own, and now they find themselves in this position. So I think it's okay for us to have a lot of compassion and empathy for people in this position, but that doesn't necessarily dictate the result when it comes to a foreign policy or whether President Trump is right or wrong on doing this. So I just want to present a few thoughts on why, in fact, everything Professor Roederer said is wrong. No, I'm just kidding. But most things. First of all, I think it's maybe a few perhaps non-controversial propositions. For instance, hopefully it's not too controversial to say that a nation should be permitted to regulate immigration inside of its borders from outside countries. And of course the Constitution gives to Congress the right to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. So, the Constitution envisioned that the federal government would be involved, and especially that Congress would be involved in these types of things. And Congress has passed a lot of rules that have given presidents a lot of discretion in how they deal with immigration. And I agree with much of what Professor Roederer said about former administrations, and there's been a lot of discretion used. And actually, I think about 2 years ago, I debated somebody from the Federalist Society and argued that President Obama was not acting unconstitutionally in creating DACA and DACA. So now I find myself in the other seat of saying President Trump is not acting unconstitutionally in getting rid of DACA or DACA either, for the exact same reasons why President Obama had some discretion in order to determine how the federal government was going to prioritize its resources in deportations of people who are here in violation of our immigration laws. So, I mean, there's two issues, right? There's the legal issue and then there's the policy issue. On the policy issue, I would say, I mean, Joshua's personal story, I think, speaks strongly to the fact that something needs to be done to try to deal with the injustice that could happen to individuals who find themselves, unfortunately, in this position. And in fact, I'd like to say, I mean, President Trump has made it pretty clear that, I have a quote, he says, "I have a love for these people, and hopefully now Congress will be able to help them and do it properly." So President Trump's position on this, even throughout, even while he said he was going to end DACA throughout the campaign, he's always expressed compassion for the Dreamers, and in fact, this is a program that should have been dealt with by Congress, because Congress really is the right branch to initiate this. And so I think by some means, there's nothing reprehensible about the president ending this program and saying to Congress, "Do your job." You know, and in fact, he's talked about even dealing with the Democrats on this, coming up with some, omnibus measure, maybe that involves a border wall or other things to try to preserve this. So I wouldn't think it would be fair to say that, the president has no compassion and just wants to end this program and throw all the DACA recipients out. In fact, if you look at the memo that rescinds the 2012 memo, it goes out of its way to do this as compassionately as it possibly can. It actually makes exceptions. It allowed 154,000 people were up for renewal for DACA, and it gave them the opportunity to renew. It turns out 133,000 of them actually did renew by the deadline. So most of the people up for renewal, if they wanted to, applied and were approved. The spokesman for the Department of Homeland Security has said that they're not going to, even after DACA expires, they're not going to use the DACA database to try to target the young people who came in under DACA to deport them. If you look at the memorandum itself, which is dated September 5th, it goes through a series of things. It says, they will continue to adjudicate these pending requests that were in the pipeline already. They are going to adjudicate the renewals, and they are not going to terminate grants that were previously given to people like Joshua. And so they've taken a lot of measures to continue this and kind of do a soft landing, if you will, so that people are not going to have their lives ripped apart. So I think, whether you agree or disagree with whether the president can or should do this, I think we at least need to acknowledge that it's being done in as compassionate a way as it possibly can in ending the program. So then that brings me to where I disagree with Professor Roederer on whether the program could be ended properly by President Trump. And I want to start with where he left off, with the notice and comment period. The problem with the way President Obama did this to begin with, and the thing that got him in trouble really on the DACA program, was there was no notice and comment period when President Obama did this program. And in fact, the case that went all the way up to the US Supreme Court, and with a 4-4 tie, pretty much affirmed what the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals did, pretty much confirmed that President Obama, at least with DACA, was supposed to have gone through a notice and comment period under the Administrative Procedures Act. This is not a constitutional issue. This is an APA issue. And under the APA, he didn't follow certain procedures. He was sued. The courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court, essentially said, yes, you needed to go through notice and comment, so this is not a proper action. It was the same thing with DACA, except DACA wasn't challenged on that ground. And so President Trump's administration was actually threatened by the same people who challenged DACA to say, we're going to do the same thing with DACA unless you do something about this. Because you've been campaigning saying you were going to end the program, you haven't ended it yet, and it's just as illegal now as DACA was. And so the idea that President Trump cannot get rid of it without a notice and comment period is a little bit interesting to me. Because there's only two options here, right? Either the program was never proper to begin with, because President Obama didn't go through notice and comment, in which case, if he rescinds a program that was never proper to begin with, I don't see why we would complain. Or it was proper to begin with and didn't require notice and comment, in which case, surely rescinding it would also not require notice and comment. So I don't think we can butter the bread on both sides on this one. Essentially, President Trump, either way you look at it, had the right to get rid of the program from a legal standpoint, I believe. And again, I'd like to mention, it wasn't even President Obama who did this. It was a memorandum from the Department of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, who essentially said, hey, this is how DHS is going to exercise our discretion. And the memorandum that's rescinding it is coming from the Department of Homeland Security, Napolitano's heir to that power, saying essentially all we're doing is rescinding the memo that came out in 2012. So, you know, to create this into a bigger issue than it is legally, I think is mostly done for either political or just trying to delay the process, gain. Finally, let me just, so that's the legal side of it. I don't think really it's a big question legally. I think if this were to go up the courts, I think President Trump would prevail on the legal issue. The policy issue is more difficult, right? Because what do you do with people like Joshua, who have grown up in the United States, who've been good citizens, who have lived in fear, who have this? And I think it needs to be dealt with. Congress needs to deal with this. The president needs to negotiate with Congress. They need to come up with a solution, obviously. But I wouldn't feel like I wasn't fully doing my job in being put up here to talk about DACA if I didn't at least bring up a few of the concerns that people have raised about the DACA program in general. With all due respect to people who individually have a lot to lose if the DACA program goes away and is not replaced with something else similar to it. One of the concerns is, there's two issues, right? One of the concerns is a sovereignty issue, and one is a fairness issue. The sovereignty issue has got to be, hey, we have laws, they need to be respected, and if the laws are not respected by people who enter the country, surely we have to be able to enforce our own laws and deport those people, like we've always done. So from a sovereignty issue, I think the policy has to be such that's going to respect the sovereignty of the country. From a fairness issue, you've heard the argument, of course, there's other people standing in line who were not coming into this country illegally, and therefore to say that, other people might get a path to citizenship, for instance, in ahead of them, who actually have been respecting the laws of the nation, it just sends a very mixed message. Like, do we want to tell all these people who've done it the way they were supposed to, that they are going to somehow, be in a less advantageous position than those who didn't do it the way they were supposed to? So there's a fairness issue here, too, to the people who are waiting. And then I've got a Hill article. The Hill is a publication you find online. That's entitled, it's dated October 19th. It's stated, "The truth about DACA is uglier than we've been told." I just wanted to cite a few of the things that they say here. I don't know for a fact whether these are all true or not. It's written by Matt O'Brien, whoever that is. Here's some of the points that they're bringing out against DACA, so I'll kind of relate some of these. Number one, many of the DACA kids were really not brought here as young children. They came in as teenagers. I guess that's factual. But the point is, some of the rhetoric has been these poor kids were brought in as babies, but that's not really necessarily the case. They could have been brought in as elder teenagers. Some of them weren't brought here at all, he says. They crossed the border themselves. So there's some percentage of these DACA recipients who weren't brought, but who came on their own volition. So that could be a fairness issue, maybe separating them into a different category, maybe not. Over 2,000 individuals approved for DACA had their status terminated from criminal activity, ranging from alien smuggling to sexual assault, and that number is still growing. So, now that may not be a very big number, 2,000 out of 700,000, maybe that's an acceptable rate of criminal activity, but I suppose if you're the victim of crime from one of those 2,000 people, maybe you're going to feel like, why is it that we were the victim of crime from people who shouldn't have even necessarily been in the country at that moment? I think that's part of the argument. And then there's some other things they list. Some of the countries that DACA recipients come from are actually quite well-developed, modern, progressive countries: Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Asian countries like South Korea. Is it really necessary for those people? Are they really having to escape some, so maybe not everybody falls into that same category as somebody like Joshua, who, maybe evokes a little bit more concern, when we see where they're coming from. So those are some of the concerns that are raised about DACA. Again, I'm conflicted on this issue, so I don't want to throw my full weight behind any of those concerns, but I do want to say that obviously there are, I think, some principled concerns about continuing the program as is, and there's some real compassion issues. How do you deal with people? Do you indefinitely just keep extending it? Do you give them a path to citizenship? I honestly don't have an answer to some of those questions. I'm sure that there's going to be suffering. No matter how you answer those questions, somebody is going to be suffering on this equation, and that makes it a really tough issue. So I would just say, in conclusion, I think it's legal, but I think as a policy matter, it needs to be fixed in a way that's going to be compassionate, but also fair. That's why we hire all these congressmen and presidents to figure out how to do that. So with that, I will see if, I guess at this point, I think we were going to, unless you want to take a few rebuttal and then a few questions.
First, we all know that all those other countries are so far beneath us that you can't say that, going back to, okay, that's a silly rebuttal. There actually is a serious legal rebuttal. This problem has come up numerous times actually in administrative law, where the agency says, well, it didn't go through notice and comment the first time, so we can take away the rule without going through notice and comment the second time. And there's case after case after case in the DC circuit, at least, where they've said, that's no good, because that would allow the agency to sort of strip away notice and comment a second time, even though people have relied on something like this, where they've relied on an agency rule, the whole program and set of rules for 5 years, and to act like this is not a major rule change that requires notice and comment, just because they didn't do it when they established the rule that's been sitting there for 5 years. So I think on that issue, I think at least in the DC courts, the DC federal court, that would not be the case. So I do think there's a notice and comment problem. But I also think that, Americans, we're a high crime society. And sure, there's going to be a lot of dreamers that will commit crimes and a lot of petty crimes, because they're Americans. And honestly, and there's a much bigger challenge for them, right? It's much harder to be a mainstream American when you don't have any of those rights and privileges given to you. So, in truth, some of them are teenagers, right? But the cap is not at 18, it's at 16, right? So it's true that if you're a 16-year-old, and maybe you came over yourself as a 16-year-old, but still, I do think that most people would think someone like that should be given a chance, the American dream. Maybe. Anyway, on to
Questions on DACA, and then we take some, or do you want to do job and discussion first? What do you want to do on that?
I have to. Somebody took my paper. Okay, so I just have to say, as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, it's no surprise. I think in America we really don't understand the history, and we tend not to like it. We've seen a lot of immigration policies that have been very discriminatory to certain groups. We've had Chinese exclusion acts. We've had quota systems placed on certain countries. One thing that amazes me is anyone in here of Irish, Italian, or Polish descent? Raise your hand. Very derogatory, discriminatory experiences. 100 years ago, your ancestors had to check non-white. But now we see these groups have been absorbed into this construct of whiteness and this privilege, and it seems that a lot have forgotten, you know, what their ancestors had to go through. There were a lot of signs that said Irish, Italian, blacks, no need to apply. You know, the Polish, and a lot of it was because they were Eastern Europeans, Catholicism, this was a Protestant nation. So it's always interesting to me when I look at the historical context of immigration or anything, how quickly Americans forget about the true past of the discriminatory policies towards certain countries, whether it be because of their religion or, you know, or the region that they came from. So I think that kind of sets us up now to talk about the travel ban, which I personally call the Muslim ban, because that's exactly what I see it being, because it's impacting countries that are primarily Muslim. So with that, gentlemen.
Take it away. All right. Okay, it's no longer a Muslim ban. It's just a Muslim plus ban, right? So yeah, this is the third iteration of the attempt of the administration to do this travel ban. And of course, Obama campaigned on it being a Muslim ban. Trump.
Yeah.
Did I say Obama?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting Yes. Sorry, I'm getting my conspiracy theories off. No, so Trump ran, of course, on an anti-Muslim agenda, and the travel ban did originally just target largely predominantly Muslim countries. Now, there were other reasons, perhaps, to target those countries, but it didn't go over well that all this rhetoric pointed towards what we would consider a suspect purpose behind the law, right? In other words, the purpose is supposed to be national security, but if basically you're saying our national security requires us to keep all Muslims out of the country, or to look at all Muslims with suspicion, well, that's clear racist, well, not racist, but religious bigotry, and that's unacceptable, right? You cannot discriminate. No matter how much discretion you have, you cannot discriminate on the basis of religion in your decisions as the federal government. States can't do it, federal government can't do it. And so it got struck down partly on that basis, partly on due process basis, because again, there was no notice. It was just, I'm going to throw this out there and it's going to be chaos. And there was a number of people that had due process rights, right? People with significant connections to the United States, people at universities, spouses, other people that had vested interests and rights that would require some form of due process, again, before you could do these sorts of things. So then it went through a couple more iterations, and the courts have all just said, you're just trying to do the same thing, except you're dressing it up a little bit more. Now, the latest iteration added Venezuela and added, took Iraq off the list and added a few other non-Muslim countries. And it was thought that that was done, well, after there was a sort of something of a serious sort of investigation into the reporting practices of the different countries and their ability to. The somewhat legitimate national security concern was that the country's own vetting of their people that might come over in a visa was really inadequate for them to be confident that the people coming were the actual people applying for the visa and things like that, right? So there was supposed to be a process to review all those countries and decide whether those countries were at risk because of the level of information and sharing and all that stuff they were doing. When they did that, they came up with, I believe, 40 plus countries. 40 plus countries on the list. A number of those countries, right, almost none of those countries ended up being banned, right? So Iraq was also on that list. Iraq came off the list. Why did Iraq come off the list? Well, because, everybody caused such a stir about Iraq because Iraq's our ally. We're trying to rebuild Iraq, right? People in Iraq are working with us. There's a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotal stories of people coming over from Iraq that are going to be blocked now that helped us in the cause to rebuild Iraq. But it's not because they're no longer a security threat, because they popped as well as all these other countries as not being able to give us accurate or good enough information. Other countries actually cooperated and improved all their reporting, and so should have actually probably come off the list, but they did not, right? And so a lot of this points to sort of the irrationality of the ban. Right? It looks like they just threw a couple more countries on to make it look like it's not a Muslim ban. Right? And at the same time, they started making distinctions between different people applying from different countries. So they add Venezuela, but they don't really fully add Venezuela. They just add Venezuela for its government officials. Government officials from Venezuela can't come over, but students and business folks can. Right? Other countries which are completely unreliable, supposedly Iran, business folks can't come over, right? But students can. Tourists can't, business people can't, but students can. Same unreliable program, but somehow we're going to distinguish and allow students to come over. Well, why are students allowed to come over from Iran? Because all the universities who have standing to sue are suing because their students aren't able to come over. It's not the businesses and the people coming on entrepreneur visas or visitors, because those people have no standing because they have no due process rights. So it looks like the latest one is rigged to try to deny standing for the people who are discriminated against by the policies, right? And these policies otherwise just blanket a whole nation. The whole nation, or anybody actually who's a citizen of that nation. Nationals from those nations. It also doesn't distinguish how much contacts you have with the nation, how long you've lived in the nation. So you can have a Swedish person who's lived his whole life in Yemen who can come in. But a Yemeni who's lived his whole life in Sweden cannot. Right? Or the American who's lived his whole life in Yemen, right? You can imagine. But the law doesn't distinguish between your contacts or anything that in substance would make you more of a terrorist or national security threat. So even if you say it's not a religious ban anymore, Congress, in authorizing discretion for the government to decide who to come and go, right, in terms of national security threats, also says you can't discriminate based on nationality, right? And this is just clearly taking a whole nation and saying, okay, we don't like Venezuela, we don't like North Korea, so it's easy. Put North Korea on the list, that's a no-brainer. Who's going to complain about us not letting North Koreans in, right? Dennis Rodman. That's it. So at the end of the day, again, it's one of these irrational sets of laws that blankets people in this sort of completely un-American way by saying, you are who you are based on what nation you come from, right? And that's why, again, the travel ban 3 has already been enjoined, right? It's been enjoined in Hawaii, it's been enjoined in Maryland, because it's basically just doing the same thing, again, without being able to articulate an actual national security interest. It fails on all grounds of rationality, arbitrariness, discrimination. It's just plain stupid. So you gotta follow that out.
Hard to follow that. It's like simply one out. So we don't have a lot of time for this issue, thankfully. But let me just talk about a few things. First of all, just to address something Dr. Hoda talked about, the history of discrimination against Italians, which I'm against as an Italian American myself. The point isn't in any of this that any group of wherever they're from, whether it's Poland or Ireland or Mexico, should be discriminated against in our country. I don't think anybody, at least with a right mind, should be arguing for that. But I don't think that the DACA program or its cancellation or the travel ban, if you want to call it that, falls into either of those categories at all. And so addressing, I know Professor Roederer says a lot of things tongue-in-cheek, which I appreciate his humor. But the reality is if you haven't read the most recent proclamation, it's rather lengthy, and they're getting lengthier because there's a lot of reasons, and they feel like, honestly, it's probably not good for national security, because now the government feels like it has to explain itself in a lot greater detail on national security matters than it ever did before. Nobody else has ever been subjected to the level of scrutiny that this executive order has been subjected to. President Obama, when he decided that those same 7 countries that we started with were not worthy of equal treatment with other countries where we had the visa programs, nobody, well, I guess the ACLU was not very happy about that, but there wasn't the same kind of an outcry as we're hearing from this. So I think part of this clearly is President Trump is not popular with a lot of people. And part of it is President Trump said some things along the way that essentially got himself into trouble, right? I think if we were to look at this in the most charitable way to the president, what you would say is from the beginning, the president has been concerned not with Muslims per se, but with Islamic radical terrorism, or radical Islamic terrorism, what it is that they want to call it that. That's always been the focus of really everything that he's been doing here has been focused on that concern. He has not always articulated it the best way, right? So you can look at some of the decisions where they list out all the things he has said, starting from back on the campaign trail, which is a question about whether that's fair to use campaign rhetoric in this. But even if it is fair, there's some things that he said there that if you took them literally at their word, would be difficult. And the courts are responding to that. The lower courts that are acting on this ban are responding to those exact statements. By now, we should realize that President Trump says things, and you just can't take everything he says literally, right? If you did, there'd be all sorts of problems, because literally, he's just not that kind of person. And I know you might not think that's a good excuse. You might think he's the president, he doesn't get a pass for that. The reality is, he says some things that are not meant to be taken literally. They're said for rhetorical effect, they're said for leverage, negotiation, whatever. Maybe you just don't like him, you think he's a bully, whatever you want to say. They may be said for a lot of things, but at the end of the day, I think if you look at this rationally, the reason we have this ban to begin with was the concern that the Obama administration was not properly vetting people coming in the country, and that people were going to come in, we were going to have terrorists coming in disguised as refugees or other people, and that they were going to create terror. And we see it in other countries. They're not the only people creating terror. The crazy guy in Las Vegas, although ISIS has taken credit for that, and we don't have the end of the story on that yet, but he clearly wasn't a Muslim extremist from one of these 7 countries. So yes, there's plenty of people who commit violence who are not that. But I think to say that there's no rational worry about terrorism that is of the radical Islamic brand is just sticking your head in the sand, right? Anybody living today, I don't think should be able to speak that, plausibly, because we see too much of it around the world. So if that's what the president was worried about, and I believe that he was, and I believe if you just have a little bit of charity with his statements, you'll recognize that that's really what he's always been saying, even if he hasn't been saying it well. If that's what he's worried about, that is not just a rational reason to have this policy, it's a compelling reason to have a policy like this, until you can actually get your house in order, like he said, engage in this vetting and all this kind of thing. So if you want rational reasons, I think he gives you plenty of them in this document. He focuses on the fact that these are countries that we feel like we don't have the kind of relationship with them, essentially, that we can trust that the vetting that's done in these countries is appropriate. And so this is meant to deal with that problem. Are there other countries that should be on the list? Maybe. We added several other countries since the last iteration. I'm sure that in the future there'll be other countries that will come on and off the list. But to treat it simply as, hey, this is a guy who just doesn't like Muslims, so that's why he did this, I think is so simplistic as to not do justice to the issue or to us as lawyers or lawyer wannabes. It's a much more complex issue than that. There's a lot more going on. And I think if we want to just politicize it and just call him a bigot and say he doesn't like Muslims, fine. That might feel good from a political standpoint. But if you want to look at it from a legal standpoint and a national security policy standpoint, I think you have to take a more nuanced approach. And I think you have to look at, does he have a legitimate concern? And is this a legitimate way to deal with that concern? And I think the answer to that question is yes on both fronts. And finally, sure, there might be other ways to do it, but that's not our place. The courts have always been very deferential to not only the military, but the president on national security issues. And I don't think this is the time for us to stop being deferential just because we don't like the bearer of the message. And that's fine, I get it. A lot of people don't like the bearer of the message, but I think, we have to recognize it's not just President Trump. There's an entire administration of people who didn't say all the things he said, who are also verifying this information and developing this policy. So even if you wanted to fault him personally, you'd have to then drag everybody else into it and say, well, they're all just doing it because they all hate Muslims. And I just think that's not really an honest way of looking at the issue. I think we need to be more, nuanced in how we view that. So I know we want to leave some time for questions, and I'm glad I didn't say anything provocative that would provoke any questions from you on this. And I'm sure Professor Roederer wants to rebut with that. Just say it's stupid, and then we'll move on.
No, so I agree with you on the first point, but on the second point, I disagree. So there are good reasons to do this, but I don't think he did it in a reasonable or rational way. And that's where I think we disagree about the deference.
Just one quick thing, we're going to go to questions. The one thing that's really interesting to me about the travel ban is that it doesn't appear that any countries our president does business with are on that list. One. Number two, I'm just saying. Number two, the reason I brought up the discriminatory behavior that had Italians and Polish and Irish had experienced in the past is because when I think of DACA, and I talked with Professor Karan, and I think of the detention holding centers, they seem to only be holding black and brown people. And I think of DACA, and I think of the rhetoric on the political trail about the bad hombres and rapists and these things, very derogatory, discriminatory comments made about Mexicans. Hence why I brought up the issues that I brought up, because when I look at how Italians and Irish and Polish were described back in the day, there really isn't much difference from what I hear now. So, we have time for questions. Are there any questions? Who has the mic? You have the mic right here.
In the back.
Gentleman in the back.
It's not working.
It seems like it's not working. Yeah, you can come on.
More response to respectfully Professor Kolenc. If the goal of the travel ban was to limit domestic terrorism, most domestic terrorism is carried out by Americans on our soil. And so that, to shift the emphasis to the travel ban, specifically Muslim countries, and that it seems a hugely disproportionate level of attention given to that. And then also for the way that it's happening, that it's taking 3 passes to make it viable, I think shows a great deal of fault in that. And then also the intention, you can't just immediately disregard campaign statements that were to lather up the voting base for Trump, saying that Mexicans were rapists and criminals, Muslims are terrorists, and then say that's the platform for the atmosphere, and then say later on, well, we're trying to be compassionate, we're sitting DACA and trying to be reasonable in the way we're instituting the Taliban. To me, that's a metaphor, but we bet the bread on both sides. And also I feel that it's a huge leap to take that commentary and say, well, he says things bluntly, but we're going to have a certain level of sophistication and specificity when we interpret those comments in a benevolent light. That seems like a huge divide and line that I can't close. And if you can, I would like to hear your
I've already done my best to close the gap on the first part, so I won't address, your comments. I think reasonable minds can definitely disagree. It's not like I don't recognize that there's comments that are made that lend themselves to being interpreted in that way. And I appreciate it, and depending on your perspective, it may be easier or less easy to interpret them that way. But addressing, I do want to address one thing said about the 3 versions, and Professor Roederer said it also, and I didn't really mention this. This third version really is the version that the other two expired, right? The first two were meant to be temporary measures while he got a more, thoughtful, deliberative process together after several months. So they always had an expiration date. That's why this new one has come out. And I didn't mention it before, but the U.S. Supreme Court on the old ones that were both challenged also, the U.S. Supreme Court granted cert, and I would put dollars to donuts right now on anybody who wants to bet that if this third one gets up to the U.S. Supreme Court, it will be affirmed by the Supreme Court, because this is perfectly legitimate, regardless of whether we might think that ulterior motives are ever fine. But I think we shouldn't read too much into the fact that the third one just came out, because the third one was always going to have to come out because it was expired. The other two were supposed to expire.
You might be right, the Supreme Court might have ruled it. But I think the government's going to have to show a little bit more than they showed, at least in the two cases that have issued temporary restraining orders against it. Because there are a lot of things in it that just don't make rational sense in terms of choosing a country and then having these different categories. The country's not responsible, but we're going to let all the students in somehow, as if they vetted the students properly somehow. So there's a lot of things that don't make sense in terms of the way they chose the countries out of the 43. It's hard to know what the reasoning was behind that and how countries got on the list and got taken off the list. Why Saudi Arabia is not on the country when that's where the 9/11 people came from. Why Iraq's off the list, other than the fact that we like Iraq now, right? So it still seems like it's not national security that's driving it. And if it is national security that's driving it, one would hope that they would be able to articulate a better rationale, and I think they'll have to articulate a better rationale for the Supreme Court, right? But that's my guess.
Are there any other questions? Come on, we have a couple minutes. Anything just burning inside you?
It doesn't work anyway.
It works now.
So I know Professor Roederer mentioned the financial hardships that, and as well as you, that the rescission of DACA would place on even just American citizens in our economy. How do you think that if Trump was to use any authority he may have to rescind DACA, justifying that financial hardship? I don't know if you mentioned that. I couldn't understand. Sorry.
The financial hardship being because these people have become part of the economy,
yeah.
And so I'm not really sure the connection to that. And that survey, there's going to be some sort of economic fallout from that, but I'm not sure that that's connected to, I guess maybe on a policy level, that's something they need to look at from a policy level. I don't think it's connected to a legal issue at all, and I don't know enough about what the economic impact's going to be to really give us a good intelligence on that, if you think that's what you can tell me also. So I don't know, do you know anything about that?
My guess with it is that, the hope, and if there is a good bone in President Trump's body, that he maybe actually genuinely hopes Congress will actually do something with this group. And the kind of things that drive Congress to do things are things like Apple saying this has a big impact, Boeing saying this has a big impact, universities saying this has a huge impact on us. So those kind of impacts stacked on. So there are impacts on other people's businesses, right? Not the actual people suffering most, but that may get Congress hopefully to do something. Because really the issue with this group, is it's bizarre in a way that this isn't bipartisan, right? That traditionally this is not a problematic group. This is not a group that people go, hey, we got to get these folks out. These are people who, by and large, came over by no choice of their own and are trying to live the American dream and have done everything right by the system. So politically, you think it would be a no-brainer. It was a no-brainer right after Romney lost, and then it became more complicated later on. But maybe this will push Congress to do something.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question before we close it out. Any more questions?
I think I'm not as well educated as some of you all. I know a lot of Professor Grant students are here who are in the immigration clinic, and I'm not educated on the entire citizenship process, what it takes, and everything like that. But I think from someone who isn't educated on the process, the only thing I've heard today is that if an issue is that they get to jump the line for citizenship, or if the issue is that they're here illegally, I'm confused of why people have to stand in line for 6, 10, 15 years to get citizenship. I'm not understanding why there is a line for citizenship. As far as Joshua, if he's here improperly and it was to no fault of his own, why not take him through a certain process and give him citizenship? What takes so long? Why did it take 2 years? And I know there are people at this school that I know who have been waiting at least 10 years for citizenship, and I'm just not understanding why the process takes so long.
Just to clarify, Joshua is not eligible for citizenship under DACA, so he can't even be in line for citizenship, even under DACA. He just gets to work and study here and live here, but he can never vote, he can never run for office. So DACA doesn't even give him that, right? It doesn't even give him a path to citizenship, does it? Now, hopefully Congress would fix that too, right? That's a lot of people wishing they would do that too, but that's where you get, I think, maybe the stronger argument on the line. But you don't even get in the line in DACA, really. You're in a different line.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the reality is the immigration system is enormous, complex, bureaucratic, and I'm sure it needs to be reformed for more efficiencies. But I suppose the macro answer, because these things are always done at the macro level anyway, I guess, is that a country can only absorb so many immigrants at any given time, and especially when you're looking at the skill level, education level, look at a country like Canada, which I just have some friends who wanted to immigrate to Canada. Canada has some pretty strict rules on who they'll take. I mean, because every nation, I think, is entitled to say, we're going to absorb you into our population, into our, social, programs and this type of thing. We have a right to, pick and choose who we're going to let in, who's going to be good for our society. And I think part of that just is a lengthy process. Can it be improved? I'm sure this isn't really my area of expertise. But I think from a macro level, I think it's more of a matter of how much can we absorb, how fast can we absorb it, and what levels of people and what are they bringing to the table to absorb it. And the Catholic part of me, of course, is also resisting that too, right? Because everybody is of equal value and dignity, and it doesn't matter how skilled or unskilled they are. And yet, a nation cannot just open its doors and let everybody in the world just stomp on in. And so, you have to have some sort of screening process. I'm sure it can be improved.
And with that, will you all like to come up and do the closing?
We just want to thank you guys for coming out. I know like I just stated, I'm uneducated on the entire concept of this, and so I know I personally got a lot out of this. I hope you all did too. And we just really appreciate you guys for coming out, and we hope to see you tonight at the Marshall screening. Thank you.